They found a mountain made of silver, not metaphorically, not a promising deposit, not a rich vein, a literal mountain, 4 kilometers of solid, extractable silver ore rising from the Bolivian highlands like something out of a myth. And for a brief moment in history, the most powerful empire on earth looked at it and believed they had solved money forever. Think about what that actually means. The Spanish crown had just finished conquering an entire hemisphere. They had armies, navies, a bureaucratic machine that stretched from Madrid to Manila, and now, buried under the Andes at 16,000 feet, they had found a quantity of silver so enormous that their accountants couldn't find a number large enough to describe it. This was 1545, and in that single moment, in that discovery, the Spanish Empire made a decision that would eventually destroy them. Not through war, not through plague, not through any enemy they could see coming or fight in open battle. They decided to take the silver, all of it, as fast as they possibly could. They built roads through impossible terrain. They constructed the most sophisticated mining operation in the history of the Western world. They engineered a supply chain that crossed 3 mountain ranges, 2 oceans, and an entire continent. Raw ore left the Andes at 16,000 feet above sea level. It arrived in the financial arteries of Madrid 60 days later. It worked. Every single part of it worked. We call that kind of operation wealth. But what the Spanish actually built wasn't wealth, it was a pipeline, and like every pipeline ever constructed, its value depended entirely on what you did at the other end. And what they did at the other end broke them. The answer to how is buried in a law so simple a child could grasp it, and so catastrophic that an empire of 40 million people couldn't survive ignoring it. It starts not with the silver. It starts with a loaf of bread. How does an empire sitting on the largest single source of currency in human history go bankrupt 4 times in the same century they discovered it? That question is what we're here to answer. And the mechanism is more terrifying than anything an enemy army could have done to them. By the time Potosí was discovered, the Spanish Empire was already something remarkable. Their logistical machine was the most sophisticated coordinated system anywhere on the planet. A ship departed Seville, crossed the Atlantic, reached the Caribbean, transferred cargo to smaller vessels, and then navigated south along the Pacific coast of South America, all on schedule, all on manifest, all accounted for by royal decree. The Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade in Seville, tracked every gram of precious metal moving in or out of the Americas. It was, in every meaningful sense, the world's first regulated commodity supply chain operating at a continental scale. And it worked. That part, at least, worked brilliantly. But inside that system, inside the entire Spanish imperial project, there was a hidden assumption. A belief so fundamental, so obvious to everyone involved that no one had ever thought to question it. They believed that money was wealth, not a representation of wealth, not a tool for measuring and exchanging wealth. The silver itself, the actual physical metal, was the wealth. More silver meant more power meant more reach meant more empire. It seemed airtight, it seemed self-evident. It was completely, catastrophically wrong. Here's the question no one in the royal court was asking in 1545, the question that changes everything once you sit with it. What happens to the price of a loaf of bread in a village in Castile when you inject 10,000 tons of new silver into the economy, but the same number of farmers are still growing the same amount of wheat? The answer is one of the most fundamental laws in all of economics. The Spanish didn't know that law yet, and by the time the consequences of ignoring it became impossible to deny, they had already triggered the largest self-inflicted monetary catastrophe in European history. Here's what's interesting, though. The Crown knew prices were rising. Their own economists were telling them. The question is why they kept extracting anyway, and the answer requires understanding something about how empires actually make decisions, which is not what most people expect. Let's go back to the mountain itself. Cerro Rico, rich hill, rises 4,824 meters above the Bolivian plateau. In 1545, a Quechua man named Diego Hualpa discovered that the mountain was composed almost entirely of silver ore. Word reached the Spanish colonial administration within weeks. Within months, the Crown had declared Potosí an imperial mining district and dispatched engineers, administrators, and laborers to begin extraction. The scale of what they built is genuinely hard to comprehend. At its peak, Potosí was the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. Larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than Madrid itself. 120,000 people lived at 16,000 feet in conditions of grinding industrial intensity, digging tunnels through the mountain with iron bars and bare hands, dragging ore through passages sometimes less than a meter wide, feeding a network of 140 water-powered mills that ran off a system of artificial lakes built specifically for this purpose. But there was a problem that no engineer in Potosí was authorized to report. The mountain was running out of high-grade ore. The shallow veins, the rich, pure deposits that had made the initial discovery so spectacular, were gone within 2 decades of extraction beginning. What remained below was low-concentration ore, technically worthless under the methods they were using. The Crown's revenue projections were built on ore grades that no longer existed. The numbers were failing before anyone said so out loud. So they did what empires always do when the numbers stop working. They changed the method. In 1572, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo introduced what's called the Patio process, a technique using liquid mercury to amalgamate silver from low-grade ore that would otherwise be thrown away. The results were extraordinary. Before mercury amalgamation, Potosí was producing roughly 150,000 kilograms of silver per year. After Toledo's reforms took hold, production peaked at over 800,000 kilograms annually. In a single decade, the mountain's output had quintupled. Now think about the logistics required to sustain that. Mercury had to be transported from the mines of Huancavelica, 1,500 kilometers away through some of the most brutal terrain in the hemisphere. Pack animals, mountain roads cut into vertical faces, river crossings, coastal shipping, transatlantic convoys with military escort. The supply chain didn't just grow, it doubled in complexity overnight, all to feed a process that had made the mountain vastly more productive and the money supply vastly more dangerous. Between 1545 and 1800, Potosí would produce an estimated 41,000 metric tons of pure silver, roughly 80% of the world's entire silver supply during that period. The Spanish treasury received its royal fifth, a 20% tax on every gram extracted. Twice a year, fleets of heavily armed galleons sailed, carrying silver in quantities that still seem almost fictional. And there were people who saw what that meant. Spanish economists were writing formal reports as early as the 1550s. Prices across Castile were rising faster than wages. Basic goods were becoming unaffordable. The data was right there, crossing the desks of royal advisors with direct access to Philip II. Those warnings reached the council. They were filed. Nothing changed. Because the treasure fleets were still arriving. Because the silver was still flowing. And because no empire in the history of the world has ever voluntarily stopped doing the thing that made it feel powerful, even when that thing was quietly killing it from the inside. The Crown needed money constantly. The 80 Years' War against the Dutch, the Italian conflicts, the Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean. Wars devour money, soldiers, ships, fortifications, mercenaries, and all of it required payment immediately in silver. So the Crown made the decision that seemed perfectly rational when viewed in isolation. They spent it the moment it arrived. No investment in agriculture, no development of manufacturing, no attempt to build domestic productive capacity. They paid their debts, funded their wars, and imported everything else from Northern Europe, from Dutch merchants, from English traders, from the Genoese banking houses that had quietly become the crown's most essential and most dangerous creditors. The silver flowed in, and the silver flowed straight back out. The first person to put the mechanism into precise language was someone no one in the Spanish court had any interest in hearing. Jean Bodin, a French philosopher and legal theorist, published his response to the paradoxes of Malestroit in 1568. He was the first writer in European history to formally articulate what we now call the quantity theory of money. His argument wasn't complicated. Prices aren't fixed by nature or by God. They're determined by the ratio between the supply of money and the supply of goods. Double the money in an economy without doubling the production of anything, and prices rise. Not because goods became more valuable, because money became less scarce. The Spanish crown hadn't doubled the money supply. They had multiplied it by a factor that economists still struggle to calculate precisely. Between 1500 and 1600, the amount of silver in circulation across Europe increased by roughly 300%. In Spain itself, where the treasure fleets unloaded directly, where the silver entered the economy before it dispersed anywhere else, the concentration was even higher, and the effect was even more violent. Historians call what followed the price revolution. Between 1500 and 1650, prices across Europe rose between 400 and 600%. In some regions of Spain, the cost of wheat, bread, and olive oil increased sixfold within a single human lifetime. A laborer who could feed his family comfortably in 1500 could not afford to eat in 1600, even though his wages had nominally gone up, because his wages were paid in silver, and silver was worth measurably less every single year. Now think about what this did to the military empire that depended on that silver. The crown paid its soldiers in silver. The soldiers spent that silver in local markets, in Flanders, in Milan, in Naples, wherever the armies were deployed. As Spanish troops arrived with heavy purses, local merchants raised prices to match. The soldiers' purchasing power dropped. To maintain the same military effectiveness, the crown had to send more silver, so they extracted more silver from Potosí, which pushed more money into circulation, which drove prices higher, which meant the army needed more silver still. They had engineered a self-reinforcing loop of monetary destruction, and they were running it at maximum speed because stopping felt impossible. Meanwhile, the debt position was becoming catastrophic. The crown owed vast sums to the Fugger banking dynasty of Augsburg, to the Genoese houses, to an entire network of creditors who had financed years of warfare on the promise of future silver revenues. But those revenues, when they arrived, bought less in real terms every year. The promise was being honored in silver that was worth less than the silver that had secured the original loan. Philip II declared state bankruptcy in 1557, just 12 years after the mountain was discovered, again in 1560, again in 1575, again in 1596, 4 defaults in 40 years. Each one announced as a temporary adjustment, each one blamed on the Dutch, on bad harvests, on the costs of war, on the failures of enemies, never once on the mountain. The empire could diagnose every external crisis with impressive precision. It was constitutionally incapable of diagnosing itself. Each time the crown went bankrupt, it renegotiated its debts, promised future silver revenues as collateral, and went straight back to Potosí for more. Each extraction guaranteed the next collapse would come sooner. The machine was designed perfectly, efficiently, to produce the very thing that was destroying it. The price revolution didn't stay inside Spain's borders. Silver moves. It flows through trade, debt, commerce, and warfare. Spanish silver traveled to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, to Ming China, where it was desperately needed as a currency medium and commanded enormous purchasing power relative to goods. It spread to England and the Netherlands, where more industrially developed economies absorbed it more efficiently, but weren't immune to the inflationary pressure it brought with it. The ripple effect reshaped the global economy of the 16th and 17th centuries in ways that historians are still untangling. Inside Spain, though, the damage was structural and permanent. As Spanish prices inflated, domestically produced goods became expensive compared to foreign alternatives. It became cheaper for Spanish consumers, and eventually for Spanish colonies, to buy English cloth, Dutch ships, and Italian luxury goods than to purchase anything made in Spain. Spanish manufacturing, already less developed than its northern European competitors, didn't just stagnate, it collapsed. Why build a textile factory when imported cloth is cheaper? Why invest in agriculture when silver arrives on schedule by the shipload? Why develop any domestic industry at all when you own an entire mountain? Economists now call this the resource curse, and the Spanish Empire is its textbook case. When a country discovers enormous commodity wealth, it frequently fails to build the productive capacity that creates sustainable, long-term prosperity. The commodity income crowds out everything else because the commodity makes every other investment feel unnecessary until the commodity runs out or stops working and there's nothing left. By 1600, the Spanish crown was an empire that possessed the world's largest single source of money and couldn't pay its civil servants on time. They had more silver than any civilization in history had ever accumulated, and less real economic power than the bankers they owed it to. Those bankers, primarily the Genoese houses, understood the dynamic clearly. They accepted silver as repayment, then immediately converted it into productive assets, other currencies, trade instruments. They were paid in silver and invested in economies that made things. The crown received silver and spent it. The bankers built wealth. The empire built debt. Now, the obvious question is this: why did it take 100 years to fully collapse? Because that's the genuinely uncomfortable part. The answer isn't incompetence. The Spanish institutions were functional. The supply chain kept running. The reports kept being filed. The council kept meeting. What failed was something more fundamental: the inability of any large system to acknowledge, in real time, that its core assumption is wrong. They kept signing emergency debt agreements with the same Genoese bankers who had financed the previous crisis, not out of stupidity, out of institutional momentum. Because naming the mountain as the problem, stopping the extraction, restructuring the entire economy around production rather than extraction, was politically unthinkable at every moment it would have mattered. Here's the principle that Potosí buried in the historical record: wealth is not currency. Wealth is productive capacity, the sustained ability of a system to generate goods, services, and real value over time. Currency is the measuring tool. When you increase the measuring tool without increasing the thing being measured, you don't expand the economy. You shrink the measurement. You make the unit less meaningful, not the underlying reality larger. This seems obvious now. It was genuinely revolutionary in the 16th century. The Spanish were working from centuries of mercantile logic. Precious metals are wealth, therefore more precious metal means more power. That logic had functioned, roughly, in a world where the supply of silver was relatively stable. Potosí didn't just expand the supply of silver. It destroyed the stability of the entire system the logic depended on, at a scale and speed no one had ever experienced or imagined possible. Jean Bodin articulated the theory while watching it happen. The economists who came after him built modern monetary theory on the ruins of the Spanish price revolution. Milton Friedman's famous dictum that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon is in part an echo of the lesson Spain taught at the largest possible scale. And the lesson has had to be relearned repeatedly ever since. Weimar Germany printed money to service war reparations. Zimbabwe printed money to cover a government deficit. Venezuela nationalized oil revenues and deployed them as subsidies rather than investment, winning elections, collapsing the economy, repeating the Spanish loop in modern form. The mechanism is always identical. Inject currency without proportional output growth, and the currency eventually destroys itself and everything it was meant to represent. Think about that for a moment. Spain had excellent engineers, competent bureaucrats, functional legal institutions, a genuinely sophisticated logistical operation. They didn't collapse because of incompetence. They collapsed because they optimized an entire civilization around a single wrong assumption, and by the time the assumption became undeniable, the optimization was too complete to reverse. The Spanish crown had the equivalent of a money printer the size of a mountain. They ran it at full capacity for 200 years, and they inflated themselves into irrelevance. Every government that has ever faced a fiscal crisis has done exactly what the Spanish crown did, blamed external enemies, rebranded the failure, and extracted harder. The mountain just had a different name. The mountain is still there. Cerro Rico rises above the city of Potosí today, in Bolivia, one of the poorest countries in South America. The silver is mostly gone. The 140 mills are ruins. The artificial lakes the Spanish built to power them have long since drained into the plateau. The mountain gave an empire more raw monetary value than any civilization had ever possessed in a single location. And that empire spent the better part of 2 centuries in a state of rolling financial crisis it never fully escaped. Potosí is a perfect system in almost every sense. The extraction worked, the transportation worked, the accounting worked, the treasury received precisely what it was supposed to receive, on schedule, every year, for generations. The logistics of moving silver from a Bolivian mountainside to a treasury in Madrid functioned with extraordinary precision. The failure was not in the machine. The failure was in the theory that told them what the machine was for. The Spanish crown believed that controlling the supply of money meant controlling wealth. They were right about the first part. They were catastrophically wrong about what the first part meant for the second. What Potosí leaves us with, the thing that makes it one of the most instructive catastrophes in economic history, is a precise illustration of the limits of logistics. You can engineer a supply chain to function across continents and centuries. You can move more currency than any civilization before you. You can build a machine of extraction so efficient that it becomes the envy of every empire watching. But you cannot engineer your way out of a wrong model. If the underlying theory is broken, if you've confused the measuring stick for the thing being measured, then every increment of logistical success is just one more precisely delivered step toward a larger, more inevitable failure. The Spanish didn't run out of silver. They ran out of what silver was supposed to represent, and no mountain in the world, however infinite it seems on the day you discover it, is large enough to fix that. If the hidden mechanisms behind how great empires built and broke and rebuilt themselves is the kind of history you want more of, this channel goes deeper into exactly that. Consider subscribing and joining the next expedition.